the dimension of anti-rationality. Anastasia, can it really be that modern mankind actually does live in the dimension of anti-rationality that the dark-haired youth mentioned? And what exactly is anti-rationality? Can we see this in real life? Thought or information appears, and we need to assess its reality only through ourselves. But how can we assess it? By what means? If a person is living in the anti-rational dimension, then he'll think in the categories of anti-rationality. Yes, that is so, but rationality, all the same, remains within a person, although in a significantly smaller degree. And if you mentally appeal to it, it is activated, and then you can use it to help you identify anti-rational manifestations. For now, we will speak no more on this topic, Vladimir. For now, go take a stroll here around the glade, around the Tega, and reflect a bit, here in this spot. Rationality and anti-rationality are in balance, but in you, they are not, and for that reason, help your rationality out. Activate it from time to time. How do I activate it? Just mentally say within you, rationality, or better yet, rationality. I was left alone and tried to reflect from a position of rationality, and these are the conclusions I began to draw. End of that chapter. The artificial world. Today's community of people lives in an artificial world, not a natural one. It created it and slavishly serves it. We have created an artificial world and live artificial lives within. The real natural world is to be found along the side of the asphalt roadways, along which modern mankind is rushing headlong towards an abyss. Artificial concepts have been implanted into the collective consciousness of modern people. Our scientists and educated researchers have, in their great wisdom, started to call modern medicine, which has existed for only 200 years, traditional, while calling folk medicine, whose history is calculated in the hundreds of thousands of years, non-traditional. At the same time as they've begun referring to healers, and here I'm talking about real healers, who are well versed in the properties of medicinal plants, as charlatans. The result is that modern man ends up having to treat many diseases, ones that people just 100 years ago easily cured themselves of, at no cost, using herbs from their very own garden, using expensive pharmaceuticals on the advice of their doctor. Perhaps there should be two paths in medicine. We need to teach folk medicine in school and train specialists in medical schools. 80% of ailments can be cured using folk medicine, and this will significantly lower the burden on today's medical facilities, which will make it possible to substantially improve the quality of medical service. But to do this, we have to think in categories of rationality. Artificial plumbing systems. Mankind has buried millions of kilometres of metal pipes that they call plumbing systems in the ground. Colossal effort has been expended to manufacture these pipes and lay them in trenches. They require continual servicing and major overhauls, which come at the cost of people's hard labour. Meanwhile, the water that comes out of the faucets in our apartments ends up being unfit to drink. And besides that, we have a natural plumbing system in the natural world, by which I mean not just rivers, but groundwater aquifers as well. Living, healing water capable of filling millions of wells flowing through the earth's veins there. The natural plumbing system requires no repairs, and what's more, it's capable of purifying polluted surface water and of saturating a vital product with minerals and other necessary substances. But the city person's modern way of life has deprived him of the opportunity to utilise the natural plumbing system that was designed and constructed by the Creator. The question arises, did man choose this way of life on his own, or under the influence of certain forces? In order to answer this question, let's take a look at one more case. We'd be hard-pressed to call it anything other than the mental illness of a society. What steps must the average family in Europe, America or Russia take in order to acquire their own apartment or home? The anti-rationality mortgage. For example, they're advised to take out a mortgage, or more precisely, they're advised to take out a loan from a bank for a period of 20 or 30 years, acquire a modest residence with the bank's money, and then, every month over the course of over 20 years, pay the money back to the bank with interest. If the family isn't able to pay the money back, the apartment will be taken away. A young family has to spend 20 years living in fear of losing their residence and, as a rule, work at a job they don't like, just so they can get paid more. Grovel at their boss's feet out of fear of losing their job. But perhaps there's no alternative to this kind of disconcerting situation. But there is, and that's not all. The alternative actually shows that obstacles that stand in the way of young people acquiring housing have been artificially implanted into their young heads. These obstacles are virtual and intrinsic only to a virtual reality. I'll give you a totally typical real-life example. A young man named Andrei lived in the city of Vladimir, and on the outside, he didn't look much different from his peers. He went to cafes and discos, he smoked and used alcohol. When he read about family homesteads, he began dreaming of his own land and home. He didn't have the funds to buy a plot of land and buy a house, and his parents weren't in a position to offer him financial help. In 2001, a hectare of land on a deserted spot overgrown with tall grasses near the village of Konyevo, 30 kilometers from the city of Vladimir, cost 30,000 rubles. Translators note 1 hectare is equal to 10,000 square meters, and this is equivalent to 750 euros. Nearly 50 families from among my readers have acquired their own hectares in this deserted spot and began putting up structures. People mostly in their middle years who possessed some financial reserves. Andrei also took a liking to this spot on the bank of the forest lake, and there was still some free land left there. Driven by his dream of having his own homestead, he stopped frequenting the youth club scene, and by working hard was able to save 30,000 rubles in the space of only 6 months and acquire a hectare of land in the deserted spot. But where could he get the money to build a home? At that time, in the city of Vladimir, a square metre of housing cost 20,000 rubles, and thus, to build a home only 50 square metres in size, he needed an additional 1,000,000 rubles. Andrei wasn't about to take a loan out from a bank, just so he'd have to spend 20 years paying it back with interest. At the age of 23, the young man went to the store, bought a good axe, and in the course of a year, all on his own, put up a wooden home on his plot. That's making a long story short. Here's some more detail. First, Andrei got a job in a company where there were master craftsmen who knew how to frame a log house. From them, he learned how to work with wood, while simultaneously earning the money to buy the logs for his future home. On this young man's plot, a garden is now growing, a well has been dug, there's a pond, and there's a wooden home, and people who are new arrivals to the settlement put themselves on the waiting list for him to build them log homes. Now Andrei is an acclaimed and respected master craftsman. You could say that through his own actions, Andrei saved 1,000,000 rubles, or that he earned them. I think that's not even important. He gained immeasurably more than 1,000,000. He gained confidence in his own abilities and a home built with his very own hands. I think Andrei will manage to find a worthy girl who will enter this home and bear him a son and daughter, and the children will tell the grandchildren who it was who built the home with his very own hands, who put in the garden, who established their small motherland. Andrei's story isn't the only one of its kind. in that same settlement, there are other families who have built their homes with their own hands. I remember how my father and grandfather also put up their own wooden home, and the neighbours next to them, my parents' peers, did the same thing. More than half a century passed, but people still live in these houses just as they did back then. And this is where questions come up. How could it happen that for half a century society has been developing new building techniques, new materials, machinery and devices which would seem to be more advanced, but in the end the average family has to work hard for 20 to 30 years to get a dwelling that it used to be able to provide itself with in the course of a year or two? For many families, the housing question has become insoluble and the government has had to take it up. Did the given situation come about by chance, or did someone artificially construct it? That, however, isn't important. The important thing is that the situation is absolutely anti-rational, but society, caught up in its everyday bustle, has turned out to be incapable of reflecting and analysing. It's gotten used to the situation and can't imagine anything different. Society has gotten used to anti-rationality and is ceasing to be rational. Why does love go away? Man's modern way of life has given birth to a great many problems that we're strictly forbidden to discuss. And since they don't get discussed, they don't get solved either. Billions of domestic conflicts take place all over the world, and they can get to the point where spouses fight with and murder each other. In so-called civilized countries, up to 80% of young people who enter into marriage divorce soon afterward. This process is preceded by negative emotions and stress of long standing, and people are made unhappy. Over the course of millennia, millions of localized wars have been going on practically all over the world between people who have attempted to establish a loving union. It isn't only both sides in these battles that take the cruelest of beatings, but their children too. This kind of situation has been presented to modern mankind as a given. It's natural, they tell us. Love comes and goes. But as it turns out, this kind of situation is characteristic only for people of the artificial world. It is not consistent with man's true nature. For the first time ever, the Taiga hermit has shown that young people's initial attraction for each other is not love. It is but the urge to give birth to the great feeling which arises when three components are united. She identified these components and showed us three ancient rites that help heal love be born. I've included them in previous books. I had to use the word rite because Russian lacks a more precise definition that expresses these rational acts by young people who feel attracted to each other and their parents. But the giving topic, like many others, turned out to be forbidden for the mass media. And that's not all. They began using plausible pretexts to make efforts to slander the source. It got to the point that on a show called The Mysterious Anastasia on Russian Central Television's Channel 1, certain individuals began collectively declaring that people were going crazy from reading my books with the statements from the Tiger Hermit. Is it tiger? Maybe that's right. Statements of the Tiger Hermit. Ludicrous. They don't go crazy from reading porn magazines or bloody thrillers or watching movies about violence, but they do from reading philosophical statements about love and man's way of life. This position makes it clear that there are forces in modern society that program social disasters. They target people and act through them, making use of their ignorance about what's really going on. And we can understand these people. Imagine what would happen if a person who's reading the Ringing Cedars of Russia book series starts asserting that by using three ancient rites, modern newlyweds can, during their marriage ceremony, in the space of 30 minutes and in plain view of all their relatives, create a family homestead on a deserted spot along with a garden that would contain around 100 plantings necessary for the family's sustenance, that they can erect a home with all the necessary farmyard structures, along with devoted animals that seem to have been settled in them as if by magic. Modern people who haven't read the Rings Cedars of Russia book series might consider a person who asserts this fact crazy or gullible, but allow me to reveal a bit about this mechanism. The mechanism with whose help the given miracles really do occur. According to ancient rites or rules, you can call them what you want, a pair of young people who feel drawn to each other go out to the outskirts of the settlement, find themselves a plot of land no less than a hectare in size, and build a small hut there. Together they create a detailed and thorough design for their future homestead. For all intents and purposes, they are also creating a space where the energy of love can be found. In the design, they indicate not only the spots where their future home and farmyard structures will be located, but also where absolutely all the plantings will go. Doing everything to create a design can keep them busy for anywhere from 3 months to up to a year. Once the design is finished, they go around to all their relatives on both the side of the bride and the groom and invite them to participate in the rite of marriage. And each time they're at the home of this or that relative, they say, for example, "Ah, what a beautiful apple tree you have there." These words serve as a hint to the invited guest about what he should bring with him to the rite of marriage. In this particular case, a slip of the apple tree that the future newlyweds liked to someone else they're inviting. They might say, for example, "What a feisty little coat you have there." That means that the guest doesn't need to think about what gift to bring the young couple. He'll give him a coat. There's a spelling mistake there, it says coat, and so on. During the rite of marriage, the newlyweds will tell their relatives and friends, as if they were taking some kind of great exam of life in their presence, all about the design they've created for their homestead, indicating in detail where everything should be located. Once they finish telling, they will give a signal, and the relatives and friends who have gathered together will set out their living gifts in precisely the spots indicated by the wedded couple. And the newlyweds, all a-quiver, will observe as their closest relatives and friends engage in the great joint action. Then the now married young couple, having experienced great inspiration and emotional elevation, will be led away, each to his parents' home, where they will spend 2 nights. In the space of this time, the relatives on the side of the bride and groom will move previously readied structures to the spot, piece by piece. At dawn on the second day, he and she will hurry to their newly created family homestead, to their first meeting as husband and wife. It's impossible to describe what will pass between them in their new home, full of nothing but positive emotions and an inspired, never before experienced energy of love for each other and for their newly created space of love. What would have happened if the Wellspring people had told such newlyweds that there will come a time when marriage will be carried out in an entirely different way? 2 young people will come to some building, sign their names in some ledger, and ride around in someone else's car that's been decorated with ribbons all around a city that doesn't and never will belong to them. After that, along with their invited guests, they will take their seats at a table in some restaurant and eat food that wasn't prepared by their hands or by their relatives' hands, and drink vodka, and that the then tipsy guests and relatives will shout "Bitter! Bitter!" to them, demanding that they kiss each other in front of everyone, and that's it. Next come the so-called marriage bed and the lack of any pleasant after effects from what has transpired. And what's more, any space that the energy of love can fill is totally lacking. Such a thing couldn't happen. It could never happen, the Wellspring people newlyweds will say. Man is a rational being, not a crazed animal who would destroy love like that. Love that is just an embryo and hasn't yet grown strong. So who is it? Who's really going crazy? Judge for yourselves, esteemed readers. To answer the question of why love goes away, we can say that real, full-fledged love simply doesn't come to the majority of modern newlyweds because there's no appropriate space for it. What is love? It is a feeling of great energy that is capable of inspiring a person to create, and that increases his spiritual powers and capabilities. It's a rational energy. It fills the space where two people in love are present and creates a unified whole for them, a space of love. Take a look at what happens nowadays. The newlyweds go to the marriage bureau to formalise their marriage. The marriage bureau facility isn't their space, but simply a temporary spot where they're spending some time. And what's more, divorce proceedings take place in this very same facility. And the rational energy of love is unable to fill a space like that. Riding around in a car, often someone else's, also isn't fitting for the energy of love, and it can't fill a modern apartment either, because after all, the energy of love can't caress soulless, dying objects in a modern apartment, not even in a very new one. Everything is aging and disintegrating with each instant. Nothing is coming to life in it. And the energy of love can't make its peace with that kind of disintegration. When it's present in that kind of situation, it can't give its blessing. What's needed for the energy of love is a living space that's been established by people. In the given case, by actual people who feel drawn to each other. It can't be any other way. The proof of this is the great number of secular divorce proceedings throughout the world. The question of why love goes away deserves to be studied from all angles, and I intend to devote my next book to this, a book in which I will tell of the ancient land where people knew the secret of everlasting love. Today's approach to love is truly anti-rational. Yep. Governing the government. There are various methods one can use to influence people. We're not excluding the government here either. And the most potent among them is the image. People grow accustomed to absurd conditions and images and accept them as givens. There's an image that tells us that the government, including the State Duma too, where laws are developed and enacted, must definitely be located in the centre of a big city. We've gotten accustomed to it being this way. But does this make sense? Where did the prophets receive their revelations, and where did the wise man do their reflecting? Whence did they bring us the divine laws? Moses, he received the tables with the 10 Commandments after going into seclusion on Mount Sinai. Christ, he went off into the desert for 40 days. Buddha, he spent several years deep in the forest. Muhammad, he spent months in seclusion in the cave of Hira on the mountain Jabal al-Nur. Philosophers and scholars, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Kant and Nietzsche and many others have also spent years living in seclusion. But where is our State Duma's building located? Where do they write our laws, these wise men chosen by the people? Do you recall? Our State Duma's building is located at the intersection of busy highways. Could we possibly create more absurd working conditions for our national chosen ones? What do we have here? A roadside Duma? There's empires to die out. I can cite a great many historical examples of images influencing human society and inducing planetary disasters. But for the contemporary person, particularly one living in Russia, the most obvious example will be the situation connected to the demise of Tsarist Russia and later on the fall of the USSR. From a spark of flame will burst forth, said the leader of the worldwide proletariat, V.I. Lenin, speaking from the Bolshevik newspaper Spark, in which the Tsarist regime was smeared, all according to plan. A negative image of Tsarist rule took root, and a new beautiful image was created, an image of Soviet rule. Tsarism was toppled. A new empire, the USSR, arose and began developing, an empire possessing a huge army and equipped with nuclear weapons. But only 7 years later, the great empire of the USSR collapsed into several separate states, ones not always inclined to be friendly with to each other. It was the politicians who had signed the agreement concerning the division, as well as the economic and political situation that political scientists identified as the culprits in the collapse. When we take a closer look, we can see all of this too as simply the result of the action of images. Let's recall Solzhenitsyn's gifted books about the Gulag and the works of other masters of the pen who smeared the USSR. Other writers at the same time were creating an image of the prospering Western states where, unlike the USSR, store shelves were groaning beneath an abundance of all possible products, and happy and free people were riding around in fancy cars. And at the same time, as they were speaking of the merits of Western civilization, they remained silent about the problems existing there. Russia's future is also defined using images that are taking root in the minds and souls of the people living in the country. Unfortunately, this is a whole pleiad of images that are leading toward the annihilation of the state. The cult of violence and the cult of money are forming the image of destruction in thousands of movies in theatres and on television. Catching up to the West. That's what many of our politicians are propagandizing. No economic or military achievements and no calls to be patriots in our motherland are capable of opposing these images. The only thing that can oppose this image is a different image, an image of creation, an image capable of inspiring millions of people. And Anastasia has created, as a counterweight to the armadas of destructive images, has created it as a counterweight to the armadas of destructive images. Hundreds of thousands of people have taken up the image of a beautiful future country and have contributed their own ideas to it and have begun making it a reality. They've begun building family homesteads. This grassroots initiative was in line with the government's plans. Many well-known politicians, government figures, well-known academic, cultural figures and religious leaders have made positive statements about those who are building family homesteads. I'm not going to bring in their statements here, but anyone who wishes to do so can learn about them on the site anastasia.ru. Now, of course, these statements have inspired people, and they are nominally off the record, although they're also infinitely bold. After all, these rational words have resounded within the landscape of anti-rationality and penetrated it. Some of the Tega Hermit's assertions might seem fantastical, and that's the way they seem to me too. When I first started spending time with her, now 15 years after my first meeting with her, there's much I've had to rethink. It's we, contemporary society, who live in a dwelling land that is fantastically unnatural for living a rational life. Anastasia speaks about rational reality. She is establishing it methodically, and she will establish it. I will try to help her, and hundreds of thousands of people are already helping. And here's what else is interesting. In electronic and print media, literature and the movies, there are practically no positive heroes who commune with the earth in a rational fashion. Call to mind the way of life and dwelling land of any main characters. For the most part, they're shown in apartments, offices, restaurants, casinos, on the streets of big cities, and in places like that. And if they do show a person who communes with the earth in a conscious way, and this happens extremely rarely, then this person is presented as immature, as an imbecile. Human society is methodically and persistently being indoctrinated about the kind of dwelling land where he should pass his life. Did this situation come about by chance? I think, and I am even convinced, that it did not come about by chance. It is leading us toward a disaster, a personal, social, and planetary disaster. When I was talking with Anastasia later on, after I'd done some thinking on my own, I said with certainty, I am absolutely convinced that contemporary mankind is living in the dimension of anti-rationality. It thinks in the categories of anti-rationality because it has no clear plans for how to construct a harmonious future. All it does is state the obvious, the fact that it is coming to an end, and speak about that. End of that chapter. The year 2012. These days, the date of December the 22nd, 2012 is being widely and actively discussed, both in esoteric circles and amongst scholars, and on the internet. Many people believe that the world will come to an end on that day. Why are we talking specifically about this date? It's because this date is connected to a gloomy, apocalyptic prediction by the enigmatic ancient Mayans, according to whose calendar, and by the way, experts admit that the Mayan calendar is much more precise than the Gregorian calendar we now use. On this day, on December the 22nd, 2012, the current cycle of the so-called long count, the era of the fifth sun, or the epoch of the jaguar, will come to an end. Legend, the conclusion of epoch of the jaguar will be followed by years of death and destruction that will continue until the epoch of the renewal of mankind begins. Scholars recently ascertained that the date indicated in the Mayan calendar is significant astronomically. On this day, an event will occur that takes place only once every 25,800 years. The sun will come into alignment with the mystical, energetic centre of the galaxy. A modern civilization will, for the first time, live through this rare astronomical phenomenon, or it won't live through it. It has been suggested that during the second millennium BCE, the Mayan forebears, whose monuments we encounter in Central America, came down from the mountains where they'd been living in the tropical forests and plains of the Yucatan. It is precisely on the plains that the Mayan civilization achieved its greatest flowering. In the first millennium BCE, the Mayans knew how to write in hieroglyphs, and their math and medicine were at a very high level. They built stone cities and unbelievable ceremonial structures, such as the great palace of Palenque. And here's the main thing, they had a deep knowledge of astronomy. Up to the present day, no complete explanation has been found for the fact that the Mayan cities began to fall into disrepair long before the Europeans arrived. At the heart of the Mayan civilization's astrology lies the count of days, the basis for generally accepted astrology of ancient Sumer and Babylon is the arrangement of the planets around the zodiac cycle. The Mayans also knew the zodiac constellations, but their zodiac had 13 constellations, not 12. They included the constellation Serpentarius, which the Mayans called the Bat, through which the sun passes for only a few days. Now, about the enigmatic calendar. The current cycle of time, which comes to an end in the year 2012, is measured starting from a very ancient date, the 13th of August in the year 3114 BCE. And this is rather strange because, as I've already noted, the culture of the Mayans themselves is a minimum of 1,000 years younger than that. Experts who study Mayan culture have not been able to reach consensus about how their famous calendar came into being. It's been suggested that the Mayans acquired the calendar along with their written language from the Olmecs, whose culture has a more ancient history. And actually, archaeologists have made finds on the territory of the ancient Olmec settlement at La Venta that confirm a certain continuity or interconnection between those cultures. But what's more interesting is something else. When scholars took a look at comparative chronology, then it became clear that certain momentous events from the past of human civilization fully coincide with the beginning of the current cycle of the Mayan calendar, the 3114th year BCE. Thus, it is roughly at the same time that the mysterious megalithic structure, the Stonehenge, begins to be constructed. Written language appears in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, following the unification of the Upper and Lower Kingdoms and the founding of the fortress of the White Wall, Memphis in Greek. Ruling dynasties were formed. In America, they began cultivating maize. One gets the impression that precisely at that time, a global cultural revolution took place across the whole planet, and that people acquired new knowledge under the influence of certain external forces. According to one of the theories, priests, shamans, and holy men of that time came into contact with some repository of secret knowledge during their meditations. Of course, the predictions of the Mayan culture, the well-known and official sources that speak of a planetary disaster, are worthy of attention. Even so, it's each thinking person alive today who can make the most important and reliable reckoning about the future. Let's try to analyse in what direction changes in the ecological situation in Russia are tending. Let's take the time span of just the last 50 years. The majority of the country's population began living in big and middle-sized cities. People in the big cities have ended up without good quality drinking water. As if that weren't enough, people have started having to pay for their most life-sustaining product. 50 years ago, a situation like this would have seemed simply fantastical to society. Today's society has gotten used to it, and it shouldn't have done so. Water is a requirement for everything, and if society agrees to the ever greater pollution of water, then it does not have the right to exist. There isn't someone up on high who's sentencing man to this, but man himself. End of that chapter. I'm cancelling the predicted hell on earth. This phrase was uttered by the Taiga hermit Anastasia. I think it's useful for the majority of people living on earth to utter similar words and to perform acts that correspond to these words. Today, this is a matter of life and death. Many people living on the planet Earth are taking note of the negative results of global warming. Scientists are spreading the word about changes in the Earth's geomagnetic field and about the flooding of entire continents in the not-so-distant future. Such large-scale disasters have begun occurring right before our contemporaries' very eyes, like the one in Indonesia where more than 200,000 people perished, and in the USA where New Orleans, a city with a population of 1 million, was flooded. Scientists are also spreading the word about impending changes in the sun's activity. Questions about the ecological safety of the Earth have arisen so keenly that they were included in the UN agenda in 2007 at England's initiative. At the beginning of 2008, they were considered by Russia's Security Council. For the first time, assertions by those forecasting a global disaster began to dovetail with the way contemporary scientists and the leadership of many states viewed this topic. The priests of the Mayan civilization also spoke about how a global disaster would occur and that it would take place in 2012. Many people have heard about this to one degree or another, but even so, public conversations about the 2012 disaster touch only a small portion of what is spoken about in talks behind closed doors. It's only by hearsay that we can guess that the Japanese government is taking steps to resettle its population. According to forecasts, England will be one of the first to be flooded, and evidently that's why it was the one to initiate the inclusion of ecological questions in the agenda for the meeting of the UN Security Council. It's possible that the governments of various countries are acting correctly by not publicising the correct situation widely and in detail. Why so panic in the people? On the other hand, the majority of a population might perish because they're out of the loop, and if that's the case, then only the informed elite would be able to save themselves, take one or 200 slaves each along with them. Scientists are making predictions about which countries will be swallowed up by the elements, the way Atlantis was, and which ones won't be subject to flooding. In Russia, for example, the coastal regions will be flooded in Siberia, and Siberia will end up being the best place to live. Following global warming on the Earth, an ice age will ensue. But what difference does it even make what kind of global disaster comes about if society is in no condition to withstand the disastrous phenomena we already have today, such as the fumes that contaminate the air in the cities, the electromagnetic radiation that penetrates our dwellings, and many others? Is there an alternative to mankind's sad future? Of course there is, but all in good time. And so, at world forums, they've come to a clear conclusion. It's possible that a disaster will occur in coming years. And so here's where an interesting question arises. Are leaders, the wealthy and science, capable of taking some kind of measures to avert it? Representatives of global science have been unable to answer this question. The governments of various countries, in an effort to affect the situation in some way, developed the so-called Kyoto Protocol, according to which all countries would be required to reduce harmful emissions into the atmosphere. Thus far, the protocol has remained unratified by many countries. What might happen in the future does, of course, cause us worry, but shouldn't a disastrous situation that's already playing out today, the situation masquerading as the triumph of civilization, cause us even greater worry? End of that chapter. The man-eating octopus. The picture that Anastasia or the dark-haired youth showed, in which people build their homes along the stinking tentacles of a man-eating monster, is not fiction at all, but the truest reality. A reality to which people have grown so accustomed that they accept it as a given. And the monster exists still and is growing in size. It is our roads and what moves along them. Information about this is available to everyone. We know, for example, that the length of the world's major paved highways exceeds 12 million kilometres, which is, for purposes of comparison, 300 times the length of the Earth's equator, which extends for approximately 40,000 kilometres. The length of air traffic routes approaches 6 million kilometres. Railway tracks are 1.5 million kilometres long. Major pipelines stretch for roughly 1.1 million kilometres, and interior waterways for more than 600,000 kilometres. The length of sea lanes equals many millions of kilometres. If we turn to the problem of pollution of the atmosphere by various means of transportation, then automobiles' share would make up 85%. And you know, the problem here isn't limited to harmful gases. We shouldn't forget about such unfavourable ecological factors as noise and vibration. So 80 decibels, which is about the noise level on a busy city street, already has the potential to harm one's hearing. And the development of various means of transportation or the laying down of highways doesn't promote psychological health either. And here too, these factors directly or indirectly affect not only drivers and passengers, but also the many people who are outside the means of transportation and communication lines. Crammed roads, sitting for many hours in the traffic jams, the fact that sometimes it's impossible even to simply cross the road. All of this sharply heightens nervousness, leads to chronic stress and increased aggression, and sometimes drives people to acts they not only never would have committed, but couldn't even imagine themselves capable of committing had they been in some other place. Yearly surveys of the condition of the natural environment in the various regions of our country eloquently express the acute nature of the problem of the ecological safety of all Russian big cities without exception. And experts unanimously recognise the intensifying process of the automobilisation of society, and the fundamental reason that the region's level of ecological safety has decreased. Even now, medical personnel are already testifying that ecological stress caused by the automotive and transport system cost the average resident of a large city in Russia 4 to 5 years of his life. Here we're talking about people, and a person, after all, can not only perceive a problem but articulate it too. But what about the Earth, for example? Although the Earth can also articulate a problem too, in its own way. It's just that amidst the noise and clatter and fumes of our lives, we are still capable of hearing the Earth's voice. What specifically is it about the automotive and transport system that is killing the Earth? First of all, you need actual Earth when you're building transportation lines, just as you need water and air. In the USA, for example, there's a statistic that the amount of land that highways, railways and airports occupy equals 101,000 square kilometres, while cities occupy 109,000 square kilometres. In Russia, the length of roads is greater than 500,000 kilometres. Well, roads are built on land. What's the problem? The problem is that when roads, pipelines and airports are built and used, the soil is destroyed, you get landslides and sinkholes and erosion advances, and then you get gullies that run along the ruts and dirt roads and grow wide out, which exasperates the situation even more. The further you go, the more happens. A large expanse of land alongside highways, railways and the oil and gas pipelines have come out onto the surface is polluted with a combination of lead, sulfur, petroleum products and other substances. Experts rank as most dangerous the strip of land that extends 200 metres outward along both side runs of the busiest highways. This is the reason it is expressly prohibited to grow agricultural products, collect mushrooms and berries, and graze livestock, especially milk producers, along the sides of roads. There are known cases of children being poisoned by the milk of cows that have grazed around roads. Near roads, the layer of air near the ground, up to a metre above the surface, is also devastatingly polluted with dust consisting of particles of asphalt, rubber and metal. You'll find lead in it, along with other substances that possess carcinogenic and mutagenic functions. Those who are found of taking a stroll or jogging along the roadside should give this some thought. And one should be particularly mindful of this when taking walks with little children. After all, when they're in a stroller or are walking, they're passing right through this hazardous zone. And there's something else I'd like to add. Please note that the greatest number of harmful roadways is concentrated not in the desert or in Antarctica, but in places with the greatest concentrations of people. And huge cities and metropolitan areas take pride in their killer multi-lane ring highways. When putting their budgets together, all governments include major financing for constructing and repairing highways. What else could they do? After all, if there were no roads, the residents of metropolitan areas might be left without food and medication. Roads are the blood vessels that provide a person living in a metropolitan area with everything he needs. Stop. What we've got here is some kind of gibberish. It truly is rampant anti-rationality. The blood vessels, which it would seem we can't do without, are in truth delivering to us a slow death. What spiritual, well-educated and intelligent people we want to seem to be. But if we leave monsters like this to the new generation, that means we are handing our very own children over to it to be ripped to pieces. Who does that make us in that case? And there seems to be no way out of the current absurd situation. But it only seems that way. There is a way out, and it lies in the way we live, both the individual person and society as a whole. The exhaust gases from millions of cars and the smokestacks of giant and small companies and other sources that belch out harmful pollutants are but an effect and not the cause that gave birth to them. The cause lies in the anti-rational technocratic way of life. End of that chapter. Heading off a planetary disaster. Now, many people, starting with the UN and the governments of many countries and ending with ordinary people, are saying that we are on the brink of a planetary disaster. There's also talk about how human acts are the cause of the disaster. It goes without saying that simply stating the fact that a calamity is approaching does not head it off. We need concrete, efficacious measures that are changing the situation for the better. But does an efficacious method for finding our way out of a crisis situation exist in nature? Yes, it does. Its code names are Family Homestead, The Ringing Cedars of Russia, and Anastasia. These words and the images, information and philosophy that stand behind them are capable not only of leading the country out of crisis in very short order, but also of initiating a new phase of harmonious development in society. So that we can understand how this might come to pass, let's first enumerate some of today's problems. Ecology. There's not enough good quality air, pure water and healthy food in the cities. Transportation. Traffic jams many kilometres long have become customary in large cities. Because of poor roads in Russia, up to 30,000 people die in traffic accidents each year. Corruption. There is much talk, including on the highest levels, about the scale of this phenomenon. A bureaucratic who embezzles from the treasury, a bribe taker and a bribe giver are no less dangerous than enemy saboteurs. Unemployment. The most dangerous consequence of unemployment is depression. When this illness overcomes one person, he turns into a living corpse. If it overcomes a segment of society, then the state is in danger of dying out. Drunkenness and drug addiction. We've been fighting these afflictions for a long time now and unsuccessfully. The housing problem. Despite all the efforts that have been brought to bear to resolve it, the situation is only getting worse. And now, let's imagine the following scenario. 50% of the population of Russia, America and Canada decides to live a healthy way of life and build a family homestead for their family on a plot of land not less than 1 hectare in size. The governments lay the necessary legislative foundation and grant these families the necessary amount of land so that they can create settlements of family homesteads. On the previously abandoned lands of former collective farms, state farms and farmlands, the people who have received land began building on an unprecedented scale. They build residential homes and the necessary farmyard structures. those who lack sufficient means do the building using their own family's labour. Those who have the means to do so hire construction crews. What's most important is that these people, each of them on their own hectare, are planting gardens and putting in vegetable gardens. Previously abandoned lands in the Far East, in Siberia and in the central region of Russia turn into blooming oases. In a state which has such oases, the food problem is entirely solved, since families who have changed their way of life not only entirely provide for themselves with first-class produce, but are also able to feed the population of large and smaller cities. The threat of a collapse of the transportation system in big cities disappears, since the quantity of cars falls by half. The air improves significantly. The housing problem is completely solved, since the housing that has been freed up is granted to all who need it. Unemployment entirely disappears, and the government need not worry about what will happen when unprofitable businesses shut down. Social tension in society falls sharply. Stratification into poor and rich no longer elicits rage and envy in most people. People have found more important priorities than how much money one has. Consciously communing with the land opens up such possibilities and horizons for man that the technocratic mind can't imagine them, not even in science fiction films. For this reason, I believe that all of us, all together, need to try to fathom what lies at the heart of the secret of this communing. Changing the way a significant proportion of the population lives will eliminate the possibility of an ecological disaster on a planetary scale. Some might say that what we have here is a very rosy and fantastical picture of the future. How can a significant portion of the population suddenly experience the inspired desire to begin living a healthy way of life? To build family homesteads by acquiring some land that's overgrown with tall weeds and pay for it themselves to boot. And all thanks to some code names and phrases. That's not realistic. That's a fairy tale. I'll tell you right off, there's no problem where this question is concerned. The words and phrases are efficacious. Tens of people are showing us this in practice. In Russia, there are already more than 1,500 settlements of family homesteads that have been set up by readers of the books in the Ringing Cedars of Russia series. There are the same kind of settlements in Ukraine, Belarus and Kazakhstan. But what is fantastical from the point of view of rationality is that government agencies have not aided these people enough and have, in some cases, opposed this beautiful aspiration. A chorus of voices on the international and regional levels is calling for measures to be taken to head off a planetary disaster. The only people who are really taking actions aimed at heading off social and ecological disruptions are the people who are building family homesteads. More than a year ago, an idea was born for each person who has founded a family homestead and who is planning to found one to declare his intentions and aspirations. The first time I read a draft of a declaration like this out loud was at a gathering in one of the settlements. The idea was picked up, and since then the text has undergone a great many changes and additions. I'm offering it here with the most significant additions into that chapter. Family Homestead Declaration. Declaration of my family homestead draft. I, a citizen of the Russian Federation, have familiarized myself with the philosophy of a way of life that has been set forth in fictional form in the Ringing Cedars of Russia book series. The idea of creating a family homestead has inspired me to take action. I've acquired a plot of land in a deserted spot out in the country, 1 hectare in size, with the goal of establishing a more perfected dwelling land for my family and for descendants, and in memory of our ancestors. I gave the given spot the name Family Homestead. On the land I acquired, I have laid out a garden, dug a pond where fish will breed, and established several families of bees. I cultivate berries and vegetables. I plan to fertilise the land using solely natural and native means of fertilisation. I believe that it will be a positive development if a large number of families who have the skills and desire to work the land and who establish their daily lives on family homesteads located around large and small cities are able to provide urban populations with a large quantity of ecologically pure vegetable produce and improve ecological conditions in the provinces. I consider it unacceptable that tens of millions of hectares of land in our country are not cultivated and are overgrown with tall weeds. At the same time, as we purchase 60% of our food products from foreign countries, and that in addition, these products are also often of low quality and are harmful to humans, especially children. I believe that this situation not only threatens the safety of food in our country, but also destroys the populaces living within its territories. I believe that under such conditions, it's counterproductive to accuse the government or anyone else of having made this or that mistake. Our entire society has made mistakes, and not only our country's society. As a result, the societies of many countries stand on the brink of social disruptions. In the current situation, it's essential for each person to think about what concrete steps he personally can take in the very near future to bring about positive changes. The example of countries that have placed their bets on family economy shows the ineffectiveness and even destructive nature of this choice. Farmers who focus on earning a profit from growing agricultural products enter into a competitive battle with each other. In order to prevail, they must use pesticides and herbicides and raise harmful genetically modified crops, and by doing this they endanger the lives of people of entire states. On the family homestead, a family lives and grows produce to meet its own needs and the needs of its relatives who live in the cities. Thus, a family living on a family homestead has a fundamentally different relationship with the land. The surplus produce from the homesteads will differ from all other produce that appears on the shelves of city stores in its beneficial nature. The intensifying worldwide economic crisis creates the threat of social disorder in many countries. If we're to come out of this crisis, we must have a fundamentally new philosophy of a family way of life, one that people will understand. And such a philosophy has been set forth in the Ringing Readers of Russia book series. I have accepted its fundamental concepts, and they have inspired me to take the actions laid out above. More than 100 families in which children are being born and raised in a more perfected ecological setting, have each acquired 1 hectare of land and are already building their own family homesteads alongside my own family homestead. Practice has shown that they're doing so not because of some infusion of capital, but because of this philosophy. I'm aware that thanks to this philosophy, tens of thousands of families in various regions of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus are already building their family homesteads. Millions of families are planning to do so as soon as a more favourable legislative basis for this is established. Many families are planning to become small business owners and produce agricultural products. I fully support efforts by the government and President of the Russian Federation to create favourable conditions for building small houses outside the cities, and to also make lands designated for agricultural use available for the construction of small houses, and to allocate each family a plot of land. I believe that each plot should be no less than 1 hectare in size, since on a smaller plot it's impossible to establish a comparably perfected and self-sustaining ecosystem and small-scale agriculture. If families are not allocated a large enough plot of land, the settlements around the cities will turn into consumers instead of producers, which will only exacerbate the food, ecological and social situation in the country. I consider it essential for us to urgently ask the government and President of the Russian Federation to speed up their work in this direction and adopt the necessary law regarding family homesteads. I appeal to the President and Congress of the United States of America, to the UN, and to the heads of all states who have a vested interest in the flowering of the peoples living in them, and recommend that they examine and embrace the idea that creating family homesteads is the most effective plan for enabling countries to come out of a global economic crisis, avert the approaching ecological catastrophe, and avoid a food crisis. A significant proportion of the peoples of Russia see the family homestead plan as a national idea. May it become an international idea, and may our countries compete with each other to make the beautiful future a reality. If the governments of various countries sincerely understand this idea, publicise it and support it, then the depression that is advancing on us can be stopped. An inspired, constructive international process will begin. The actions of thousands of Russian families have already proven the positive influence of the family homestead plan. More than 1,500 Russian families, who have already begun building their own family homesteads, have signed declarations like this one. We continue to collect signatures. I wish all like-minded people success and inspiration as they creatively build a beautiful environment where their families can live in various countries and in the world as a whole. Signature of the founder of the family homestead. With the passage of time, this document, which has already taken on a life of its own, began to give rise in me to an ever-growing feeling of significance. I was getting the feeling that it's not a passport, a diploma, or any awards that constitute a person's most important documents, but precisely this kind of declaration. Returning in my mind to this document again and again, I keep trying to understand why I was having these feelings. The text and language may vary, but they aren't what's most important here. What's important is the essence. I read the declaration to Anastasia, told her about my feelings, and she asked, "What do you think, Anastasia? Why do you think feelings arise, and not only in me?" I've spoken with many people, and they also experience the feeling that the declaration is very significant. But no one can explain why that happens. Why is it? You see, Vladimir, the feeling that this document is significantly immediately arose in me also. But like you and these others, what about it makes me feel that way? I am unable to explain that immediately. Perhaps we need to ponder it a bit longer. Perhaps, but I've already pondered it a great deal. The feeling that it's significant remains, but I still haven't understood why that is. Suddenly, Anastasia drew herself up somehow and began to shine. She began speaking, pronouncing each syllable distinctly, just the way she always did when she was trying to emphasize something significant. "Vladimir, I think I am beginning to understand where its great significance lies. Look, when the Creator was creating the earthly world, before the great creation, he first gave voice to his intention. He imparted it to all the entities of the universe, and when they asked, 'What is it you so fervently desire?' he replied, co-creation and joy for all who behold it. But can it really be so important to impart your intentions to everyone? Of course it is very important, for imparting it to all means, above all, imparting it to yourself as well. It means comprehending what is taking place and believing in yourself. Besides, having declared your intentions in words, you are already materializing them by imparting them to all. You call upon them to join you in co-creation. Why do I need to call upon everybody? I mean, somebody might laugh at me, or oppose me, or be indifferent. Derision, opposition, and indifference will be participants in the co-creation from the other side. They are needed to fill out this creation, within which you will bring everything into balance. I'm feeling an excitement inside, Anastasia. Where's that coming from? Vladimir, I too feel excited. This document has appeared as a herald of a newer era on Earth. The aspirations of the people who stand behind it are holding within them a great realization. For thousands of years, people lived without determining their own lives. What were they striving for and why? What should the new generations carry forth? Should they bear in mind where those paths went wrong? Which paths? Amidst the bustle of life, women gave birth children, but they offered no goals in life to those they bore. Their children knew not what they were to carry forward, and they would die. The earthly civilizations have lived out their empty lives. Only pottery shards remained of them, and arrowheads. The children would heed others' opinions of their own parents. And what your grandfather wanted of life, Vladimir, he did not impart this to your father and mother in words, nor did they impart that to you in words. You are their continuation. Tell me, what kind of continuation did they want in life? I don't know, I can only imagine. You can imagine whatever you might like, but you know for sure that they did not impart it, their life's aspiration. Of course they didn't. Nor do all the people I know. For the first time in perhaps billions of years, as if awakening at dawn, a man has said, I have an aspiration. I will begin my creation, and my generations will live in a promised land around them. And they will perfect the promised land around them. Of course, they will be more perfected than I. But I will begin it all, and a little part of me will live on in my descendants. You can cite many examples of how that which we do not impart in words dies along with the physical body. A man was thinking about how he might improve for his descendants the land where he lived, and he planted a cedar tree on his plot. Before long the man died. 29 years passed, and the tree grew into a beautiful spreading cedar, 15 meters tall. Within but a year it would have borne marvellous healing fruit, but people, the children of this man who had planted it, cut it down. They thought, why do we need this tree here? It casts a shadow over part of our plot, and its shade is keeping the tomatoes and cucumbers from growing in their beds. And they cut down the spreading cedar, and they cut it down precisely because the man had not given voice to his intentions. Genghis Khan conquered nearly half the world and brought Russia, India, China and Palestine together beneath his rule, so that there would be no war. He built roads, lowered taxes, and honoured the traditions and cultures of various peoples. But he himself lived not in the palaces he had seized, but in a yurt. He sought to bring wise men from all over the world to him. Together with these wise men, he talked about how they could go about making people happy, and how to help everyone come to know eternity and immortality of peoples. Of all conquerors of the earth, His empire endured the longest. He knew something. He attained, laid it. But the empire collapsed all the same, and Genghis Khan has come down to us through the ages as just a conqueror, who from among those alive today is able to say what his true intentions were. He didn't give voice to them. Well, perhaps they were just destroyed, or are preserved in scrolls somewhere now. Intentions should be preserved not only in scrolls, but in the hearts of the people. Genghis Khan wasn't able to give voice to them so that they would be passed from generation to generation through the ages. Those are striking examples. It's amazing why, for millions of years, didn't people attach any particular importance to the need to give voice to their lives? Now I'm thinking the same thing, that this document presages a new era. Tell me, Anastasia, how will you give voice to your aspirations, both before people and yourself? Why, all of my aspirations are already laid out in your books, Vladimir. If I were to add anything else specific, I'd say I will gather together the best sounds from the whole universe and will embed them into the combinations of letters and into musical notes. I will ask today's poets, you, Vladimir, and the bards to give voice to them. A great many people will sense them in their soul. Let people express them in a language they understand. Let them model the dawn of the earth and its beautiful flowering. And when the melodies of man's worthy land embrace the entire earth, then I, among our kind neighbours, will help our grandchildren create their homesteads, and all the while I will not forget my own family space. But what should I say to myself, and how should I voice my own declaration before people? Each person needs to consider that on his own. Yes, of course, each person on his own. Even this draft I already have resonates with me. I think on my own about it, what I can add to it and make it my own. I'll ask all the readers to consider it too. This document is essential. It's an important missive from the founders of a family homestead to the future generations of their family line. It's a directive that comes from the people and goes to those at all levels of power, a communication with them. It will be a good thing if each family keeps a beautifully designed document like this, like a kind of relic alongside the family book of the family homestead's founders or those who intend to found one. A person will read it with awe and gratitude in his family homestead's beautiful garden, even 100 years later, and he'll read it and recall the founder. And another person 100 years later, a person who has lost his way in life's whirlwind, will suddenly come across it, and he's looking through his parents' old things and will read about their unfulfilled intentions, and the person will have a burning desire to make them a reality. And I think it would also be useful to send this kind of document to each member of local governments personally, and to the UN. Similarly, I consider it essential to establish a yearly scientific and practical conference called Family Homesteads of the Future, under the auspices of the UN. End of that chapter.
Just remembered